I want you to stop what you're doing and really listen. Because what happened yesterday at 4:47 p.m. might be one of the most significant moments in American legal history. This isn't political gossip. This isn't speculation. This is the Supreme Court of the United States making a decision that changes everything. Before I say another word, I need you to understand what you're about to hear. This is not just another legal maneuver. This is not just another appeal being denied. This is the highest court in the land answering a question that has never been asked before in 248 years of American history. The Supreme Court has spoken. And what they said, or more precisely, what they refused to say, tells us everything we need to know about what happens next. Let me be very clear right from the start. Yesterday afternoon, the Supreme Court denied an emergency bail application. That one-page order, issued without explanation, without dissent, without comment, just activated an incarceration timeline that cannot be stopped by any court in America. I want to be very clear about what happened. This is not a political rally. This is appellate procedure. I have handled emergency bail applications at every level of the federal court system, and I know what a Supreme Court denial means. Before you dismiss this as just another legal maneuver, I want you to look at this docket entry. This is what we call an emergency application denial. It is the reason incarceration is no longer on hold. The media tells you this is about politics. They tell you it's unprecedented chaos. But I am going to show you the court record that proves this follows exact appellate procedure. I am going to show you the legal standards, not the spin. If you want to understand what happens when the Supreme Court denies emergency bail to a criminal defendant, especially a former president, you are in the right place. The Supreme Court Clerk's Office issued a one-page order denying the emergency application for bail pending appeal. The order is public record. It's brief. It cites no reasoning. That's standard for emergency denials. But the implications are significant. I've handled emergency bail applications at every appellate level for 3 decades. Let me show you what this denial actually means procedurally, not what the headlines claim it means politically. Here's what most people don't understand about Supreme Court emergency bail denials. They don't happen in isolation. By the time an emergency application reaches the Supreme Court, it means 2 lower courts have already denied the same request. This isn't the first decision. It's the third. The Supreme Court doesn't review bail applications as a matter of routine. They only see them when defendants have exhausted lower court options and claim there's an emergency requiring the highest court's intervention. When the Supreme Court says no, after 2 other courts said no, that pattern tells you something about the strength of the legal arguments. I'll be tracking every procedural step as this develops. Court orders, not speculation. If you want to follow the actual legal process, subscribe. Let me walk you through how we got here. Emergency bail in federal criminal cases follows a 3-tier appellate structure. Understanding that structure is essential to understanding what just happened. First tier, the trial court. After conviction and sentencing, a defendant can request bail pending appeal from the judge who presided over the trial. The legal standard is specific. The defendant must demonstrate that the appeal raises a substantial question of law or fact likely to result in reversal or a new trial, and that the defendant is not a flight risk or danger to the community. The trial court in this case denied that application. First denial. Second tier, the Circuit Court of Appeals. When the trial court denies bail pending appeal, the defendant can file an emergency motion with the Circuit Court, the intermediate appellate court that will eventually hear the appeal itself. The Circuit Court applies the same legal standard, but reviews the trial court's decision for abuse of discretion. The Circuit Court in this case also denied emergency bail. Second denial. Third tier, the Supreme Court. When both lower courts deny emergency bail, a defendant can file what's called an emergency application with the Supreme Court. This isn't an appeal of the conviction itself. It's an emergency request for the court to intervene and grant bail while the regular appeals process continues. The Supreme Court applies the same legal standard, but adds another layer. The applicant must show not just that they'll likely win the appeal, but that the denial of bail causes irreparable harm that can't be remedied even if they win later. Yesterday's denial was the third level. 3 separate courts. 3 independent reviews of the same legal arguments. 3 denials. You've heard the term stay pending appeal. Here's what it actually requires under federal law. Clear demonstration that the appeal presents a substantial question likely to result in reversal, and that incarceration pending that appeal would cause harm that can't be fixed later, even with a successful appeal. The headline says, Supreme Court denies bail. The actual story? 3 separate courts reviewed those legal standards and concluded the defendant failed to meet the burden at every level. But here's what makes this Supreme Court denial particularly significant, and why experienced appellate lawyers are paying close attention to this pattern. If you're thinking 3 consecutive denials signals weak appellate arguments, you're reading it correctly. Let me show you why. I've seen emergency bail granted by appellate courts in cases involving far more serious convictions: life sentences, capital cases, organized crime prosecutions. Courts grant emergency bail when they see a substantial likelihood that a significant legal error occurred at trial that will likely result in reversal. The fact that 3 courts reviewed the appellate arguments here, and all 3 denied emergency relief, tells you something about how those courts assess the likelihood of success on appeal. Here's the legal distinction that matters: frivolous appeal versus preserved error with arguable merit. Every convicted defendant has the right to appeal. That right is absolute. But not every appeal raises substantial questions that make incarceration pending appeal inappropriate. Courts look for specific indicators of strong appellate claims: clear legal error in jury instructions, improper admission of prejudicial evidence, prosecutorial misconduct, insufficient evidence to support the verdict. When appellate courts see those issues with merit, they often grant bail pending appeal, because there's a realistic chance the conviction won't stand. When appellate courts deny bail at all 3 levels, it signals they've reviewed the record and don't see those substantial questions. They see arguments that deserve appellate review. Every defendant gets that. But not arguments strong enough to justify the extraordinary remedy of releasing a convicted defendant from a sentence imposed after trial. 3 courts reviewed the same trial record. 3 courts examined the same appellate arguments. 3 courts concluded the legal standard for emergency bail wasn't met. I've prosecuted cases where appellate courts granted emergency bail despite my objections as a prosecutor. It happens when the appellate issue is clear and substantial. The fact that it didn't happen here, at any of the 3 levels, is significant. That's not political commentary. That's appellate procedure working exactly as the federal system designed it. Let me know in the comments. Does the fact that 3 separate courts denied bail change how you view the strength of the appeal? I'm curious what you're seeing in this pattern. Now let me show you what happens next procedurally. When emergency bail is denied at all 3 appellate levels, the trial court's remand order takes effect. Here's what that means in practical terms. The trial court issues what's called a commitment order, a formal order directing the defendant to surrender to federal custody within a specified time frame. In most federal cases, that time frame is 14 days from the denial of the final bail application, though judges have discretion to shorten or extend that deadline. You've heard the term self-surrender. Here's what it actually means under federal criminal procedure. Instead of being immediately taken into custody by marshals, the defendant is allowed to voluntarily report to a designated federal facility by a specific date and time. It's a courtesy extended to defendants who aren't considered flight risks, allowing them to arrange personal affairs before incarceration begins. Once the surrender deadline passes, the defendant enters Bureau of Prisons custody. The Bureau conducts an intake process: medical screening, security classification, facility designation. That process typically takes 24 to 48 hours, after which the defendant is transported to the facility where they'll serve their sentence pending any appeal. And here's what many people don't understand. Incarceration can proceed while appeals continue. That's not unusual. That's standard federal procedure. The appeal doesn't stop just because the defendant is incarcerated. Appellate briefs still get filed. Oral arguments still get scheduled. The appellate court still reviews the trial record and issues a decision. If the appellate court reverses the conviction, the defendant gets released and the time served gets credited. If the appellate court affirms the conviction, the defendant continues serving the sentence. The political conversation focuses on whether this is fair. The legal reality? The Supreme Court has spoken, and court orders have procedural timelines that activate when emergency applications are denied. The defendant retains full appellate rights: right to file briefs, right to oral argument, right to appellate counsel, right to raise every preserved legal issue. Those rights don't disappear because incarceration begins. They continue throughout the appellate process, which in federal cases typically takes 12 to 18 months from notice of appeal to appellate decision. But the incarceration proceeds simultaneously. That's the consequence of 3 courts concluding that the legal standard for bail pending appeal wasn't satisfied. The Bureau of Prisons doesn't assess guilt or innocence. They don't evaluate the strength of appeals. They execute court orders. When a commitment order is issued and surrender deadlines pass, they process the defendant into custody according to federal regulations. What happens next is mechanical. Surrender deadline arrives. Defendant reports to designated facility. Intake processing completes. Facility assignment finalizes. Incarceration begins. Appeals continue on their own timeline. But here's the broader question this raises about presidential immunity claims and whether this case sets precedent for future prosecutions. The Supreme Court's denial of emergency bail doesn't just affect this defendant. It sends a signal about how courts will handle similar cases in the future involving former presidents and claims of immunity. Let me break down the constitutional questions at play here. 2 distinct legal issues have been argued throughout this case. First, can a former president be criminally prosecuted for actions taken while in office? Second, if prosecution is permissible, do standard criminal procedures apply, including incarceration pending appeal? The Supreme Court has previously addressed presidential immunity in civil cases and stated that presidents have absolute immunity for official acts within the outer perimeter of their duties. But criminal prosecution raises different constitutional questions about accountability and the rule of law. What yesterday's Supreme Court denial signals, and I'm choosing that word carefully because denials don't create binding precedent, but they do indicate the court's view, is that even if immunity questions remain open on appeal, that doesn't automatically exempt the defendant from standard post-conviction procedures. Here's the distinction that matters constitutionally: immunity from prosecution versus immunity from procedural requirements after conviction. The immunity arguments raised throughout this case claimed that a former president cannot be prosecuted for official acts. Those arguments were rejected at trial and are being appealed. But the emergency bail application raised a different claim: that even if prosecution occurred, the unique status of a former president requires different treatment on bail pending appeal. 3 courts, including the Supreme Court, rejected that secondary claim. They applied the standard legal test for bail pending appeal: substantial question on the merits plus irreparable harm from incarceration, and found it wasn't satisfied. That procedural treatment matters for future cases. Every future prosecution involving a former president will cite this case as precedent for how courts handle post-conviction bail applications. The argument that former presidents deserve special procedural treatment different from other criminal defendants has now been tested at 3 appellate levels and rejected at all 3. Fair question that many are asking: does this prove equal treatment under law? Or does it prove the system treats political figures differently? Here's what the record actually shows. The legal standards applied here are identical to the standards applied in every federal criminal case. Substantial question on the merits. Likelihood of success on appeal. Irreparable harm from incarceration. Flight risk assessment. Danger to community evaluation. Those standards don't change based on who the defendant is. What changes is the scrutiny. When the defendant is a former president, every procedural decision gets examined under a constitutional microscope. But the legal standards themselves? Those remain constant. The Supreme Court could have intervened. They could have said this case presents unique constitutional questions requiring emergency relief, despite 3 court denials. They could have granted bail pending appeal to avoid the unprecedented situation of a former president in federal custody. They didn't. That decision, or more precisely, that non-decision, since denials typically don't include reasoning, signals the court's view that standard criminal procedure applies, even in unprecedented circumstances. This isn't just about one case. It's about whether the constitutional system creates different procedural rules for politically powerful defendants. The Supreme Court's denial suggests the answer is no. When the Supreme Court denies emergency relief in a case this constitutionally significant, it sends a message about institutional equality. The criminal justice system, with all its procedures and standards and appellate safeguards, applies the same way, regardless of the defendant's former position. That's the precedent being set here. Not through a formal opinion with binding legal reasoning, but through procedural treatment that future courts will cite and analyze. So where does this leave us constitutionally and procedurally? Here's what we know from the court orders issued across 3 levels of federal judiciary. Trial court conviction upheld, emergency bail denied at district level, Circuit Court denial of emergency relief, Supreme Court denial of emergency application. Incarceration timeline now active. Appeals continuing on standard schedule. The appeal continues with full appellate rights. Appellate briefs will be filed according to the Circuit Court's briefing schedule. Oral arguments will be scheduled. The appellate panel will review the trial record. The defendant remains entitled to complete appellate review of every preserved legal issue. But that review happens while incarceration proceeds. That's standard procedure in federal criminal cases when bail pending appeal is denied. The constitutional questions remain open. The appellate court will still decide whether the prosecution itself was constitutionally permissible. They'll still review claims of presidential immunity. They'll still evaluate whether the trial was conducted fairly and whether the evidence was sufficient to support the verdict. Those questions get answered through the normal appellate process over the next 12 to 18 months. But the procedural questions, emergency bail, incarceration pending appeal, special treatment for former presidents, those questions have been answered by 3 courts, including the Supreme Court. The answer at all 3 levels was that standard criminal procedure applies. The courts have spoken at 3 judicial levels. The appeals continue through established constitutional process. We're watching the system handle an unprecedented situation using established legal standards and procedures. That's not a political statement. That's not a partisan observation. That's the federal criminal justice system operating under Supreme Court oversight in a case that tests whether constitutional equality means equal procedural treatment regardless of political power. The trial happened, the conviction occurred, the sentence was imposed. Emergency bail was sought at 3 levels, all 3 denied. Incarceration proceeds while appeals continue. That's how federal criminal procedure works when the system functions according to its designed structure. 3 courts, same legal standard, same conclusion. If you want to follow how this constitutional process continues, subscribe. And let me know in the comments. Does the Supreme Court denial change how you view the strength of the immunity claims? I read every one. The system is being tested. Let's watch how it continues to work.